Hello everybody, welcome to another video. When I last left this series, I was talking about the happy chapter in human history that was Mao Zedong's leadership in China. And in the next part, I want to explain how China became a superpower in the years after Mao Zedong's death. Now, today China obviously is a very important economic power. That's mostly because of the size of its population. If you look at all countries in the world, China ranks towards the middle. Per person, it's less wealthy than countries like Mexico or Belarus. So it's definitely not what would be thought of as a rich country. But the country as a whole is much, much better off than it was in the 1970s, for example. And today its economic strength can be attributed mostly to the policies of a man called Deng Xiaoping. If you remember one person in Chinese modern history apart from Mao Zedong, it should really be Deng Xiaoping. So if you remember from the Mao video, Deng Xiaoping was one of Mao's subordinates. He was one of his administrators who'd helped him during the Great Leap Forward. After the famines, he, along with Liu Shaoqi, the other second in command, had stepped in and managed all of the communes themselves and allowed peasants to have small private plots of land, and therefore alleviated the famine in the 1950s. Later, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao was very unhappy about this because he felt that they'd betrayed the communist cause and challenged his power, and so both Liu and Deng were purged. Liu was sentenced to prison for life until he died, and Deng was sent into exile in Jiangxi in the east of China. And so he stays here for a good 10 years. Just before Mao's death in 1976, Mao allows Deng to kind of come back and somewhat rehabilitates Deng Xiaoping into the party. But basically he still doesn't trust him, and so he keeps him at arm's length, so he allows him to have some control over the economic policy, but ultimately doesn't want him to have very much influence in the party because he doesn't believe that Deng is committed to the communist cause. Deng's most famous expression is that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, only that it catches mice. Basically meaning that it doesn't matter what the theory is, as long as it is able to produce a good outcome, so in this case more food, more productivity. But this made him an enemy of the hardliners within the party and Mao. And so after Mao dies, the person who is supposed to succeed him is a general called Hua Guofeng. Hua is basically Mao's ideological disciple. He just worships everything that Mao says and literally goes around saying that everything that Mao ever said must be right and that the party should just stick to this, all of Mao's sayings, and then it won't go wrong. But because of all the chaos of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, basically so many party members are purged and so many are injured in these 10 years. It means that it turns them all against Mao's style of leadership. None of them want to be in the same position where there's a dictator that takes over the party and that can therefore basically lock up and torture any of the party members who displease him. And so a lot of the elder party members are very fearful that this is what will happen under Hua Guofeng. And so they all convene in a conference to decide the future of the party. And so one thing you have to know about Deng Xiaoping is that, if you like him or not, he was very, very crafty and very, very calculating. And so before the conference, he basically goes around and does these backroom deals, communicates with all of the senior party officials, and makes it clear to them that from here on out the party is going to be governed by collective leadership, meaning that no one person will be in charge. And he basically says, if you support me in carrying this out, I will not be the chairman of the party, I'll take a backseat role. We can fulfill the aims of the party without a central leader who had the power that Mao did. And so at this conference, Deng steps up and voices opposition to what Hua Guofeng is saying, and all of the party leaders pretty much support him. Hua Guofeng basically realizes he's been screwed, and so Hua is allowed to be general secretary, whereas Deng is officially the head of the commission, which really is running everything from behind the scenes. And while all of this is going on, you have a very important trial happening after the Cultural Revolution, which is the sentencing of Mao's wife, Chang, Madame Mao as she was otherwise known. So during the Cultural Revolution, Chang, Mao's wife, and 3 other officials had used the secret police and their own private army of Red Guards to basically imprison and torture anybody who had disagreed with them in the past or insulted them or who they felt owed them something. So they basically used the Red Guards as a way to settle private scores. Jing, Chang and the 3 other officials together are known collectively as the Gang of Four. And so after the death of Mao, you have a sentencing of the Gang of Four. And what this means is basically that the entire Cultural Revolution is blamed on the Gang of Four. It also allows them, in a way, to clear Mao's name and say that Mao didn't really do anything wrong. He only had good intentions. Really, it was all the Gang of Four that were manipulating things from behind the scenes. But this gives the party a way to save face. And so at this trial, Jing, Chang and the other officials are all sentenced to life in prison, where she and others will later commit suicide. And during this trial, Deng actually becomes very important because he's the one leading the charges and he basically engineers the whole thing, which gives him a lot of prestige within the party. It's shortly after this that Deng embarks on his policy of reform and opening up. And because Deng is more of a pragmatist or a Chinese nationalist than he is a communist, he visits the Prime Minister of Singapore, and in Singapore he sees how much better the living standards are than in China. And after a conversation with the Prime Minister, he basically goes back to China in 1979 and decides that he's going to do the same thing in China, and he's going to do this by opening up special regions across the country called SEZs, Special Economic Zones, which will allow foreign investment into them and they will build up infrastructure. And so basically he wants to remove most communist restraints on the free market. And this is where Deng Xiaoping becomes quite controversial as a character, because traditional Chinese historians think very highly of Deng. He's painted as the kind of hero of modern China who took the country away from Maoism. More recent scholars like Frank Dakota, for example, they don't really give Deng a lot of credit. And what Dakota says, for example, is that after the Cultural Revolution, the party was so damaged and its infrastructure was so weakened that ordinary people just opened up markets spontaneously across the south of China, especially in Guangdong. And so that when Deng comes into power, the party tries to shut down all of these markets, but they quickly find that all of the local officials are working with these local markets, they're being bought off, and therefore they can't really do anything, because the officials just refuse to go along with it. And so because of that, it was actually just the ordinary people of China that allowed it to open up economically, rather than the policies of Deng Xiaoping. And so I think you do have to give Deng some credit because he's able to successfully ride the wave of this economic success and introduce foreign direct investment. And so you have these special economic zones in China, certain areas like Hainan, Xiamen, and Shenzhen, which today are some of the most developed areas in China. Shenzhen in particular was founded as part of Deng Xiaoping's legacy. It was barely even a village in 1985 when he first founded it, and today it's bigger than London. And this is why people tend to like Deng, because he is kind of a pragmatist above everything else. And he realises that communism will never actually develop China into a modern country, and he recognises that being strong economically is the foundation of this. And so after this, after the reform and opening up, this is when he says that China is not communist, it's actually in a market socialist state. And so this is when he comes up with the phrase socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is today what all of the Chinese leaders repeat dozens of times every time they make a speech. Another legacy of Deng Xiaoping is China's very low-key foreign policy. In 1979, Vietnam invades Cambodia and removes the communist dictatorship there, which is led by Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge. And China was supporting the Khmer Rouge, they were supporting Pol Pot. And so in 1979, Deng decides to invade Vietnam as a way to teach them a lesson. And so the Chinese troops invade Vietnam and they basically get beaten so badly that they have to withdraw after a very short campaign. And it basically reveals that the Chinese military is very, very not up to scratch. It's easily beaten by Vietnam's forces, although China kind of declared victory and just left. But basically the invasion of Vietnam in 1979 was so disastrous, and after that Deng said that China should try to keep a low profile in terms of foreign policy, because it would just attract a lot of negative attention otherwise. And that's why, ever since then, China's been very careful not to get involved in any overt military conflict. Obviously, the great challenge for Deng's leadership comes in the 1980s. Because this is a time when you have this massive foreign investment going into China. It's also a time where China is really opening up. because it's been cut off from the rest of the world for so long, and so all of a sudden you have foreign movies, foreign tourism for the first time. Chinese people are allowed to study abroad, foreign companies are allowed to enter China. And so you also have the spread of very new political ideas like democracy and reforming the party. And it's also a time when China allows a lot more free speech. Compared to today, the 1980s is probably the freest time that China's been in its modern history. Some of the writers at the time talk about how they were able to have magazines, political magazines, that openly called on China to become a democracy and for the party to reform. And Sung Fong-he and others at Tiananmen Square said that in the 1980s they opened the first polling organisation in China and basically became like an informal opposition party. And so they had this kind of almost internal multi-party system. Having a magazine that called for the government to become democratic is something you could never have in China today. It would be shut down immediately. And actually, the top leadership of the Communist Party were kind of divided on this question. Deng Xiaoping said that, well, China may eventually become sort of democratic, maybe in the year 2030, 2040. He was thinking way after maybe 70 years of opening up. But he wanted to put it off till then. His main focus was on stability. But the party does react against this openness to an extent. So compared to the Mao period, where there's just never-ending purges, the Deng period feels quite peaceful. But they do have several communist campaigns, like the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, which is an attempt to combat Western ideas of democracy and also combat religion, because religion sort of made a big-time comeback. In the 1980s, you had all these Taoist and Confucian cults in the countryside, and a lot of their leaders are executed during this campaign. You also have democracy advocates in the 1970s and 80s who were executed before Tiananmen Square, and there were protests in the 1970s about this, which are largely unknown today. And so, even though Deng was a reformer, he was very ruthless when it came to anybody who challenged Communist Party rule. But in the 1980s, you have the development of basically a liberal reformist element inside the Communist Party itself, and some of them become the top leaders inside the party. So first you have an official called Hu Yaoban, who becomes General Secretary in 1981, and he openly criticises Mao's leadership completely. And he writes in a party speech before his removal that China should eventually become a democracy and that is the best way for its development. And so the guy who's appointed after him is another liberal reformer called Zhao Ziyang. And he basically goes through the same trajectory and also wants to see China eventually become a democratic state. And these were people who were officially the leaders of the party. You know, General Secretary was the highest position, although in reality it was obviously Deng Xiaoping behind the scenes running everything. But every time he tries to express his views within the party, he's met by opposition from the die-hard conservatives. And this is the background that leads up to Tiananmen Square in 1989. So, what caused the Tiananmen Square protests? Well, first of all, this was nearly 10 years on from the reform and opening up that Deng had started in 1979. And because you have this economic growth, you have an influx of all these new ideas, but you also have an incredible amount of corruption that was accompanying the economic growth. And so a lot of the original protesters were protesting against this corruption. Although it's nothing compared to what happens in China today. At the time, it was an issue. And you also, in the months leading up to the protests, you had massive amounts of inflation, which meant that people's savings were basically getting wiped out every couple of months. But the triggers for the protest was the death of Hu Yaoban, the first reformer who was appointed General Secretary in the 80s, who I mentioned before. Because many people felt that he'd represented this reformist element inside the party and represented ordinary people, but he'd actually just been silenced by the party elders and left to die on his own. And the most important thing to remember about Tiananmen Square is that the protest movement was much, much bigger than Tiananmen Square itself. You had tens of millions of protesters in Beijing, you also had tens of millions in Shanghai, in Nanjing, in dozens of Chinese cities across the whole country. It was actually the biggest democratic protest movement in history. And so to portray it as an incident in Tiananmen Square is just revisionist history. Now, a lot of people leading the protest were students, but a lot of them were also ordinary workers who were concerned about the same issues. People wanted greater transparency, the abolition of certain party structures, and they wanted to adopt free speech. These protesters themselves were unarmed. There were very few calls for violence. The vast majority of the student leaders wanted any reform to happen completely peacefully. and there were no official calls for violence before the troops were called in. Today, the Chinese Communist Party lies about it and portrays it as a violent struggle of students who are trying to overthrow the government. That's not what was happening at all. The protests basically cause a crisis inside the Communist Party leadership, because Zhao Ziyang, the guy's general secretary, he supports the students, and so do many other of the younger leaders in the party. And after occupying the square for several days, Zhao gives a speech to the students where he says that many of their concerns will be taken on board, that he wants to reform the party, that there'll be a negotiation, they're just patient. And he pushes a message of leniency towards them. While Zhao is away from Beijing, the conservatives, like the mayor of Beijing, a man called Li Peng, basically move in and try to push him out of the leadership. The students have a brief meeting with him, with the Beijing mayor. It doesn't go well. They're angry at him for previously attacking some of the students and not admitting to it. And because of this, a lot of them, the student leaders, say they basically missed their chance to negotiate with the government. Li Peng, the mayor, goes to Deng and says that the students are radical, that, nothing can be done about them, that they want violence, etc. We don't know exactly what happened, but Deng seems to have said that the square should be cleared by any means necessary. And Li Peng takes this and he personally orders the troops and the tanks to open fire and gun down many of the students in the square. And so Zhao Ziyang is then placed under house arrest a matter of hours before the tanks roll into Beijing, and he's kept under house arrest for the rest of his life until he dies in 2005. He's almost never mentioned again in the state media until his death. We know from interviews with student leaders and others that actually a lot of the troops in Tiananmen Square stood down and refused to carry out the orders. But there was basically a squadron of elite forces that carried out the killings. The exact figures are still very controversial. They range from being just a few thousand to nearly 200,000 in some cases. Because we also have reports from other writers that there were many people killed in other cities like Chongqing and other cities in China. We also know that in Tibet, tanks were called in as well and hundreds of people died there. Wang Dang, one of the student leaders, he said that after he was arrested that he was treated more leniently because he was a student, but many of the workers who protested were simply executed. Deng Xiaoping does bear ultimate responsibility for what happened, even though he might not have given specific orders himself. But he later defended it, and he basically could never really accept that people could openly challenge the party and could never see a way to reform it. Because of Tiananmen, you have the complete crushing of this liberal reform element inside of the party. After the massacre, China became an international pariah. They were very heavily sanctioned. And the party basically decided that you could have all kinds of cultural activities, that was fine, but nothing that actually challenges party rule. And after this, they reformed the education system. They introduced the patriotic education campaign, because it was thought that it was the liberal universities that had allowed the protests to take place. And to this day, many Chinese schools will have children dressing up as communist soldiers and marching and doing flag-raising ceremonies. Deng, in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, and especially the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, Deng faced a very, very big pushback from inside the party about his policies. There were a lot of leaders who felt that protests had occurred because of the liberalization and the opening up that Deng was pushing, and that China would go the way of the Soviet Union if they didn't reverse. And so there was a brief period in the 90s where they tried to revive Maoism a little bit, which is led by an official called Chen Yu. And in the 1990s, you have these 8 very powerful members in the Communist Party who are known as the 8 Elders. And basically, if you want to get control of the party and enact policies, you need the support or the approval of the 8 Elders. And so basically, you have this struggle between Deng and Chen Yu in the 90s to take control of the party and persuade them about the direction the country should go in. And Chen Yu uses the media, which he has control of, to criticize Deng. And so Deng is in his 90s at this point, but he firmly believes that economic opening up is the right policy, and as long as you don't liberalise politically, the party will be okay. And so to get support for his policies, he embarks on something called the Southern Tour. He does a tour of going through all of the regions in the south of China, which were traditionally seen as being very poor, and he broadcasts and shows how much better all the living standards are. And he uses it as a campaign to show all of the successes that his policies have had in improving people's lives in the South. And so a lot of people see this, and within the party a lot of people see this, and then Deng gets a lot of support for his policies, and the elders then basically side with Deng. Jiang Zemin, who takes over from Deng after he dies, was appointed by Deng after the Tiananmen Square protest because Jiang was in Shanghai and he was able to diffuse the protesters there non-violently. And because of that, Jiang is made General Secretary and takes over the Chinese government after Deng dies in 1997. And the person who becomes president after him in 2002, Hu Jintao, he's also handpicked by Deng as a possible successor. And so when Deng finally dies in 1997, he leaves behind a China which is far more economically prosperous by a long way. He'd basically achieved what Chinese leaders had wanted to do since the Opium Wars. But he leaves behind a political structure that is fundamentally unchanged, and it has all the same tyrannical power structures, and the same totalitarian machinery is always there. The difference is that Deng was much more willing to scale back these repressive tools. But in the years after Deng's death, all it took was for another ambitious leader to come along and take control of the party for all of Deng's reforms to be swept away.